In 2003, on this very day, I cannot believe time flies, doesn't it, 20 years ago, UK troops led, of course, a coalition, followed, should we say, the US into Iraq. Now, this issue has divided people for the years that follow. It really did divide opinion at the time, and it certainly still does to this day. Many people might recall you had protests, some of the biggest protests I think perhaps this country has ever seen. Of course, those protests as well were global. It wasn't just restricted to the UK by any stretch. We've just been talking about the ICC. They've got an arrest warrant out for Putin. That has got a lot of people talking, John, and saying that actually if the ICC wants to issue arrest warrants, they should perhaps start by looking at the likes of Tony Blair, the likes of Bush, etc., for what many would call an illegal war in Iraq. Your thoughts?
Well, one of the things we're absolutely clear about 20 years on is it was not an illegal war. If it was an illegal war, somebody had brought a court case, been dismissed in any court people tried to take it to. It was a legal war. It was backed by a United Nations resolution. And it was a war in defence of the integrity of the United Nations weapons inspection framework and the weapons inspector's right to enter a country and inspect their weapons. That should be absolute, because we can't keep the peace if people are refusing to accept the authority of the United Nations. What Putin has done is a war crime. People, you know, the footage is clear. A war crime, and the war criminal should be arrested and prosecuted. If he steps on any soil of any country who can arrest him, they should do that immediately. But the Iraq war was fought in defence of the United Nations, and we've seen since the Iraq war many examples of people trying different routes to it, but we didn't succeed in Libya, we didn't succeed in Syria. Interventions in other countries to enforce the rule of law are very difficult.
But you say about the UN, and actually the military action wasn't sanctioned by a UN resolution, and the head of the UN at the time, he said, I think he said it in 2004, he did call it an illegal war. So when you say it's absolutely, you know, cast iron certain that it was a legal war, there'll be so many people out there, and I could almost hear you, I can almost feel the heat from your fingers typing away. You will be getting in touch with me saying that it was regarded by many as an illegal war.
But let's be absolutely clear. British troops are not deployed on illegal operations. The armed forces have their own legal advisors. They take legal advice. They would not have deployed, none of the leaders of the armed forces would deploy our troops in an illegal way. So it's not simply there's been no court case taken, it's that our troops wouldn't do it. And it's if people calling it a legal war saying our armed forces and the leaders of our armed forces would act illegally. That's not true.
Or, well, there's a difference between knowingly doing something and being misled into doing something. Mark, let me bring you in, your thoughts.
I mean, back at the time, gosh, I was a young teacher doing my teacher training then. It felt to me like a justified war. We were told there were weapons of mass destruction out there, that Saddam posed a threat to lots of other countries, not just his own people. Let's be clear, he was a fascist, psychopathic dictator. He was a nasty piece of work. What's really sad is we failed on nearly for every reason that we went into there, we failed against those aims. And not only that, because Tony Blair and his government at the time misrepresented the strength of the evidence that they had, it started to undermine people's faith in government, and we're still dealing with that now, 20 years on. And what I think is really sad is it also gave some really genuinely bad regimes out there an excuse to turn around to their own people and say, you can't trust the West, you can't trust Western values, because look at what they did in Iraq. So we're still dealing with the mess that Tony Blair created and left behind.
It's fair, isn't it?
I went to Iraq on a number of occasions. One is I worked with President Ayad Alawi, the Prime Minister of the Transitional Government, and I worked to develop the programme for government for his manifesto. I also went to the Kurdish region of Iraq with Nadim Zahawi. And the question that all of the Iraqi politicians I met, Barham Saleh, the Kurdish leader of the party who was also Deputy Prime Minister when I was working in Iraq, he said the question was not, why did you come to Iraq? Why did you wait so long? Why, in the face of a genocide, of a genocide of Kurds, why did the West stand back, stand away, do nothing? So the question for Iraqis is never, why did you come here? Why did you take so long?
So when you look back, you know, 20 years down the line, you look back at the decisions that Tony Blair made, the way he kind of expressed things, Do you actually think that he acted in good faith? Do you look back and think that... You say that absolutely cast iron set, and that you don't think that he exaggerated any of the claims when he said, for example...
Sorry.
Go on, you go.
Tony took it to a vote at the House of Commons. This was a decision of the UK Parliament. It wasn't a decision of Tony Blair alone.
But many
it was put to the Parliament as a democratic vote. Every MP who voted for this has as much responsibility as Tony Blair.
But many of my viewers, and I can see you coming in on your email thick and fast, and I'm going to bring lots of you in as well throughout the programme, certainly before the end. Many people will say, yes, people voted on it, but they were misled. The information that they received was exaggerated. All these claims about weapons of mass destruction, 45 minutes, I think, was the claims.
The information that the UK security services had is the same information the French and the Germans had. It's just that those countries didn't want to deploy troops. It's not that people disagreed. There was not a contest of information on the security service from the security services. It was that Britain went with America and other partners into Iraq and European countries. I mean, the French and the Germans were happy to come in after to take the post-war reconstruction contracts. They didn't want to come in the alliance that liberated Iraq. And that's a fair choice for them. But nobody of any of the Western countries said the security information says something different. The man was a genocidal fascist psychopath. He had form, and he had been talking about and developing the weapons of mass destruction. And we had to decide whether to act in defence of the United Nations weapons inspectors or not. The Americans acted and Britain acted with them, backing up a UN resolution. We didn't act in an arbitrary way.
The claims of sexed up dossiers or whatever it was called, dodgy, that's all untrue in your mind?
I think Tony Blair made a good faith decision that the security service information was shared across the Western world. People differed about whether you should act on it. And it's a perfectly fair case to say fascist dictators should be left alone to torture their own people. And by and large, that's actually what's done around the world. We don't Rwanda. When Rwanda had its genocide, the Tory government at the time stood aside, did nothing. One of the biggest genocides. The fact that we did act on good faith, and that, I think, is really important to understand.
Mark?
I think if we take a step back, Tony Blair was a massive disappointment in so many ways. He came in, he said he was going to clean up politics. He was a pretty straight kind of guy. He ended up undermining politics because of bad decisions he made. He said he was going to improve education. Standards fell. I know, I was working in schools at the time, money went up, but standards fell and schools were a lot less safe because of policies he pursued. He had a chance when he came in because there's a massive budget surplus. They broke the government, so by the time 2008 came on with the financial crash, we had no money left to sort it out. They pumped money into the NHS, they didn't reform it. They left a welfare system that paid people to not work, made people worse off if they're working than if they didn't work. So it was massively, massively disappointing. And I think that's one of the main things that led to the situation we're in now, where people have really lost faith in a lot of politicians. I'm not saying it just started there. He really made it. Oh, he said he was going to protect the union. The devolution deal has made the union a lot less.
13 years of Tory government, and it's still Tony's fault. That's the thing is, Tony Blair, a titanic figure, dominates politics to the extent that, having stood down in 2007, everything is still his fault.
Titanic figure like the ship, more like.
Let's just remind ourselves, shall we? I think I've got a clip, actually, of the Chilcot report. Many of you will be, reminding yourselves of this. It went on, this investigation cost millions of pounds, took, I think, about 7 years. Let's have a look, because many conclusions were reached at the back of this. Let's have a listen to some of them.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. the government failed to achieve its stated objectives.
That's Sir John Chilcot speaking there. When you listen to that, and I'm sure you're familiar with it already, doesn't that make you kind of question your viewpoint?
No, Chilcot and his inquiry are making different judgments on the same information, same evidence that Tony Blair had. The essence of leadership is to choose, to judge and to act. It is not to dodge and duck. You know, probably what we did in some of the other interventions that Tony did, like in Kosovo, are actually less founded in international law than what we did in Iraq. But people don't mind that because actually the Kosovans were saved. If we hadn't acted, you know, there's loads of kids called Tony Blair in Kosovo because Kosovans were saved. There's loads of people in Sierra Leone who still celebrate the liberation by the British Army from the violence there. People can't go back and relitigate. The decision was made, voted on by the House of Commons. Chilcot spent years, and he found no smoking gun, no smoking memo. He just said, in his view and the view of his committee, there could have been other things done. Well, there was also a time window because as the summer comes, it's actually harder and harder to have any realistic military action. If you build up with the backing of a UN resolution to a point and you say, unless, then we will, and then you go, actually, do you know what, we might not, you've taken the armed force up to the top of the hill, taken them down again, and Saddam was never going to take that seriously after that. So I think you can go back and try and do it in 2020 vision like Chilcot was doing, but he was essentially tabling a set of different opinions on the same evidence. Of course people have different opinions, but 412 MPs had the same opinion as Tony Blair.
I think the thing that was so toxic, and it's a bit how some people feel regarding lockdowns and some of the stuff we've been through with the pandemic and COVID now, particularly seeing the WhatsApp files, is that there was confidence was falsely projected when actually being more honest about the doubts, the reasonable doubts that people would have had would have enabled people to maintain trust. A strong leader would stand up to say, look, I can't be sure about this. We are pretty confident that this is going on, but I can't be sure. But as a result, I'm going to go ahead with this and let's see what we can find out. To stand up there and make everything seem so black and white, to make everything seem so certain about WMD and what would happen afterwards, that was wrong. And that's why people were felt so let down about it afterwards.
Sir Keir Starmer, actually, he referred to the Iraq war as being illegal a couple of years ago. I would be fascinated to see whether or not he still holds that view. Many of you getting in touch saying, wouldn't it be interesting to hear the view of Dr. David Kelly? Yes, it would. But of course, you'll all be familiar with the fact that that is not possible because he died, apparently, by suicide. I've got to say, to me, when I look back...
You believe there were weapons of mass destruction? I mean, David Kelly was never questioning the fact that there were weapons of mass destruction. He actually, the tragic death of David Kelly is completely unconnected to all of this.
Look, 179, British military personnel lost their lives in this conflict. Let's not forget that actually what happened was after Blair and Bush had gone into Iraq, there was a humongous void. There wasn't any consideration at all as to what they were going to do, or at least seemingly no consideration as to what they were going to do when Saddam Hussein was indeed toppled. There was a huge void. Civil war carried on for years afterwards. Many people would say, actually, that when you look at a lot of the kind of rise of jihadist groups, a lot of it would stem from the voids left by Blair and Bush. To me, they seem to be two men that were desperate to almost play soldiers, as though it was some toy game. Very sad consequences that I would say continue to this day. Many of you are in touch with me saying that no one and nothing will ever convince you that this was a legal war. Many of you are of the view that Tony Blair should have been tried and should indeed, I mean, you can't preempt the outcome of a trial, but many of you do believe that Tony Blair does deserve to be behind bars. I want you to keep your thoughts coming in 20 years to the day when the UK joined the US in invading Iraq. Was it worth it? Is the world better? Is it safer as a result of those actions?
Look, if viewers think it's an illegal war, they should probably name the law they think was broken, and nobody ever does. They just go, illegal, illegal.
Okay, so
They disagree with it. They disagree with it. Like, everybody's free to disagree with it. But just to call something you disagree with illegal is like, okay.
Well, OK, well, he's set a challenge to you then. Many of you getting in touch is saying it's an illegal war. What laws would you say were broken? What kind of charges do you think should be brought against Tony Blair? If you're in the camp that are telling me some are, he's set you a challenge. Get in touch with me on the email, gbviews@gbnews.uk is how you can reach me tonight. Or you can tweet me at Michelle Jubes or at GBNews if that is your thing.